Most of us remember, a lot of us still cringe, as we saw in August 2012 when Cecilia Gimenez, who was a member of the Sanctuary of Mercy Church in Borja, Spain, decided to do her own restoration project with the beautiful mural fresco of Jesus that's called Ecce Homo, which is, in Latin, it actually means behold the man. It's something that's taken from John 19 when Pilate presented a Jesus who had been scourged to the Jewish leaders. This was first painted at this church in 1930, and it was done by Elias Garcia Martinez as a gift to the church. And over the years, it had been a beautiful gift to the church because it had brought in tourists, it had brought in people to the church who normally wouldn't come. But then over the years, there had been water deterioration. A lot of it had flaked off. The colors had kind of faded in places. And so in 2012, Ms. Gimenez decided that she was going to restore it, that she was going to fix it on her own. Believe it or not, you have the before and the after picture there. Ms. Gimenez never had a day of art lessons in her life. Now, I know you may be surprised at that when you see it. I mean, and truthful to be told, I think there's been a lot of work and a lot of conversations about the artistic work that Ms. Gimenez did, about the changes that she made to Martinez's original fresco. But I don't think anybody sums it up better than Christian Fraser of the BBC. This is what he said about the changes in the work of Ms. Gimenez. He said the delicate brushstrokes of Elias Garcia Martinez have been buried under the haphazard splattering of paint. The once dignified portrait of Jesus now resembles a crayon sketch of a very hairy monkey in an ill-fitting tunic. Gotta admit, one of my most favorite quotes ever because it's just so blunt and direct, right? Crayon sketch of a very hairy monkey. Anyway, all those involved, except for Ms. Gimenez, had wished that she had never touched the fresco. Ms. Gimenez believes she has done a great job, but everyone else doesn't like the changes that she's made. They'd wish that she had never really gotten involved. And here's the deal. This is how most of us see change when it happens around us. We think change is going to end up always like this. Change is never good. Change is just a train wreck waiting to happen. Change is something that we are uncomfortable with. It brings fear of the future. It brings insecurity. Change is something that we're so uncomfortable with that we fear it. And we often try to control it. We don't like change. None of us do. But here's the reality. Change is inevitable. Change is going to happen. You can't stop it and you can't prevent it. Change is part of life itself. And so instead of fearing change, instead of trying to control change, and instead of ignoring change, for a Christian, for a believer, our response is to trust the God who never changes, to follow the God who is always faithful, to keep our eyes on the God who always remains. Bottom line is change is not bad. Change is inevitable. And we should never focus on the change itself. Because it's never about a person or a circumstance or a situation. For a believer, change is always about the God who remains. And that's exactly what our passage is about today. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 15, God declares that He is remaining in His power and presence with Israel, even though there's a leadership change between Elijah and Elisha. Today I want to look at this passage as a group, and as we look at it, I want to divide it up into 4 parts. We're going to see the journey, we're going to see the plea, we're going to see the departure, and then we're going to see God's presence. And then we're going to talk about how it applies to each of us today. And if you are a Christian, if you're a believer, well, this passage should help you to understand that in the middle of the change and transitions in your life, you don't focus on the change, you focus on the God who remains. You trust Him because He is always faithful. Today, if you're not a Christian, if you're not a believer, what this passage really helps us to understand is the change that you're looking for, the change that you're searching for, is only going to happen when you come to God through faith in Jesus Christ. He changes, He transforms. And that's what He wants to do with you if you'll come to Him through faith in Christ today. So as we begin, let me just give you a little bit of background or just a little bit of context for our passage. Do understand that the books of 1st and 2nd Kings were actually written to explain why Israel was being removed from the promised land. That God in His faithfulness had continually shown His love, His mercy, His grace to Israel. In His patience, He continually had reached out to them, called them to come back to Him in fellowship and in relationship. But Israel had continually turned their back on Him. They had run after their will and their ways. They had wanted other gods, and they wanted to do what they want. They had ignored and rejected God and His will, His way, and His love. And since 1 Kings chapter 17, God had been revealing Himself through the prophet Elijah. But that was about to change in 2 Kings chapter 2. He's now going to begin working through the prophet Elisha. And what we see in this change of leadership, what we see in this transition between leaders that God is going to work through and God is going to speak through, what is the predominant tone, what is the major message of this section, is that it's not about the men or the circumstance or the situation. It's about the God who's faithful and who is not going away. And that He is the one that's to be trusted because He's the one who's really all about. So as we pick up our story in chapter 2, in verses 1 through 6, we see first the journey. We see the journey that Elijah and Elisha take place on their way to the Jordan River. Now, what's really interesting to me as we begin this is that in verse 1, we are told from the very beginning that the prophet Elijah is about to be taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. Now, do know this, that the word that we translate whirlwind in the Old Testament language, in the Hebrew, is actually basara hashmaim. And it translates into the storms of the heavens. So the bottom line is this: we really don't know what is taking Elijah up into heaven. We really don't know how it's being done. But what really matters is not the how or the what, but the who. There's no doubt that God is the one who is doing it, and He's the focus of this whole passage. So from the very beginning, we know a transition is about to take place. What's also really interesting in this passage is this, is that how many people know that this transition is going to happen? I mean, we as the readers have known since 1 Kings chapter 19 that Elisha was going to take Elijah's place. We've just been waiting for it to happen. And then in verse 1, we're told, now's the time. As you read the text, we know very clearly that both Elijah and Elisha know that today is the day. That God has revealed to them that this is going to take place. But more than that, there's about 50 anonymous prophets as well, the school of prophets, who know that's going to happen, who kind of follow them around. God has also revealed it to them. So what does that tell us? This tells us that what we know, what we understand, that this is not a random event. This is not a surprise to anybody. That God is working, that God is doing the change, that God is doing the transition, and He wants His people to be a part of it. Verses 2 through 6, what we see is the journey itself. And in the journey, it's actually significant. It's very symbolic. Each place actually does mean something. They start in Gilgal, and then they go to Bethel, then they go to Jericho, and then they're going to go across the Jordan River. Do know this is backtracking the journey of the Israelites when Joshua took over leadership from Moses. They were at the other side of the Jordan, crossed the Jordan, went to Jericho, went to Bethel, went to Gilgal. And this is supposed to be what we're supposed to pick up on. That they're very specific in their journey, is that at the end of their journey, they're going to end up in the very place in which Joshua took over leadership from Moses. And just as God had always been with Moses, just as God had always been with Israel, God was going to be with Joshua. And he was going to continue to be with the Israelites. And what we have an understanding is this, that as the same God who was with Moses and then was with Joshua, the same God who's with Elijah is now going to be with Elisha. So as we get this understanding, as we get this idea, what is it that we can see from these verses? What is it that we're supposed to understand? That God is the one who often instigates change. That God is the one who does it. And God makes his people aware. And it's really not about the change or the person or the situation or the circumstance. It's always about the God who remains. And so what we're supposed to understand as we begin, that as change takes place in our lives, as transitions takes place in our lives, that not all change is random, not all change is circumstance, not all change is bad. And in the midst of change, in the midst of transitions, we often get caught up in situations and circumstances and locations and people. But the bottom line for a believer is this: it's never about those things. It's about the God who is faithful. It's about the God who was there before, who is there now, and who will continue to be there. It's about the God who remains. So as believers, in times of change and transition, we're always to trust in the God who remains. So we turn back to our text. What we see in verses 7 through 10 is the plea. What we see is Elisha's plea to Elijah, his desperate plea before his departure. Look what it says in verses 7 through 10. And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance. And while the two of them stood by the Jordan, now Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water. And it was divided this way and that, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And so it was, that when they had crossed over, what Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask, what may I do for you before I am taken away from you?" Elisha said, "Please, let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." So he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be." So Elijah and Elisha make it to the banks of the Jordan River. And Elijah takes off his mantle, his cloak, his robe, which actually was symbolic of his prophetic ministry. He rolls it up and he smacks the Jordan River and it divides. The last time we saw this was when Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River into the conquest of the Promised Land. As God was with Moses, as God was with Joshua, God was with Elijah. And as Elijah is the one who God works through to part the Jordan rivers, not only does Elisha see it, but so does the 50 prophets. And that's important. Because in this we see that God gives a tangible way, a visible way, a physical way that his hand is on Elijah and everybody sees it. And that becomes important later. So Elijah and Elisha, they cross over dry ground. They get to the other side of the Jordan. And finally Elijah looks at Elisha and says, "Man, whatever you're going to ask me, just go ahead and ask it. I mean, I can tell you want to ask me something." And we know it's been building to this. All through verses 2 and 6, Elijah's saying, "God is leading me to Bethel. You just stay here." Elisha says, No, I want to go with you. Elijah says, "God is leading me to go to Jericho. You just stay here." Elisha says, No, I want to go with you. And then Elijah says, "I'm going across the Jordan." Elisha says, "I am not leaving. I'm staying with you." It's obvious that Elisha wants something, needs something. And Elijah finally says, "Hey man, just tell me what you want." And Elisha says, Elijah, you got to promise me that I'll have a double portion of your spirit. You got to promise me that. Now understand this, a double portion is actually a Hebrew idiom. It means it's a Hebrew saying. It's a cultural saying. It's something that their culture knew a lot about. It's something we always don't pick up. We have cultural idioms, sayings in our culture. We say things like LOL and BTW, and we use language, right, that we understand, that we grasp. And sometimes teenagers use language that I still don't grasp. I mean, I know we're in the same culture, but I still don't get it, right? But in the culture, we say things that we all get, we all understand, right? So I want you for a moment to think about your emails. I want you to think about your texts. I want you to think your posts on Instagram, your snaps on Snapchat. I want you to think about everything that you send out. And you're thinking right now, well, everybody understands what I'm saying, but will they understand it 100 years from now? Will they understand it 1,000 years from now or a couple thousand years from now? Will they really understand some of the things that you're saying? And for some of you, I'm going to say no, because I can't understand what you're saying now. So they're not going to understand it that way in the future. Now, will they get the general overtone of the message? Yes. Will they get kind of general, but they won't always get the cultural sayings. And this is sometimes things that we struggle with. Do know that a double portion in this culture was something that was given to a son or a successor from the father figure in his inheritance. It just meant they got more than everybody else. So listen, understand that Elisha is not saying, I need double what you got. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is this. He's saying, Elijah, if I'm taking over for you like I'm supposed to, if I'm supposed to be your successor, you've got to promise me that God's going to work in me like he's working in you. You've got to promise me he's going to be with me like he was with you. You've got to promise me that he's going to do this because I can't do it. And we understand that's exactly what Elisha is saying, because we understand that Elijah's response is coming from a man who lives under God's authority. A man who understands that he serves a king. He says, man, I can't promise you that. I don't tell God what to do. He tells me what to do. I can't tell you that he's going to have his hand on you or not like he had on me. I don't make that call. But he has told me to tell you this, that if you see me go, then that's your physical, visible sign that he's going to be with you. But if you don't, he's not going to be with you. So as we look at Elisha's plea, what does it tell us? What should we know? What you need to understand and what I need to understand, that in times of transition, in times of change, what we need more than anything else is God's power and God's presence. See, this is what Elisha understood. He says, I'm about to take over from here. I'm about to do what God is calling me to do. And he says, I don't need more training, and I don't need to be equipped, and I don't need a strategy, and I don't need a plan. What I need is God. I need his power. I need his presence. That's what I need. In times of change, in times of transition, what we need to do is trust. We need to stay focused in the God who remains. We need to understand that there is no plan, there is no strategy, there is no vision, there is no direction that doesn't start with him. What we need more than anything else is Christ. In times of change, in times of transition, it begins and ends with the God who remains. We must keep our eyes on him. As we turn back, we see in verses 11 and 12 the departure. We see the departure. Then it happened, as they continued on and talked, that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire, and separated the two of them. And Elijah went by a Basara Hashmaim, a whirlwind, into heaven. And Elisha saw it. And he cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. So he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes and tore them into two pieces. Do you understand that in the Old Testament, a chariot and horses often describe power and presence, and God's power and presence is often described by chariots and horses as well. So if the Basara Hashmaim, if the whirlwind wasn't enough to let us know that God was in control, his visible presence through the fiery chariot and horses is like an exclamation point. There's no doubt God's the one who's doing this. There's no doubt God's the one who's in control. He is making the change. He is making the transition. It is about him. And then what we see is grief. I mean, Elisha's grief is overwhelming. He says, my father, my father. Listen, the term father is not thrown around lightly. It shows that he loves Elijah. He saw him as so much more in a closeness and a relationship. He calls him actually the chariot and horseman of Israel. What he's saying is God revealed himself. God revealed his power through you to all of Israel. God revealed himself. God revealed his power to all the nations. He's just saying you were an amazing man of God. And then he tears his clothes, which is a visible, tangible sign of grief and heartache. From this, what we do understand is that even in times of change, even in change that God is initiating, transitions that God is doing, there's often grief, there's often heartache. But the most important thing to see from this section is that Elisha saw it. That Elisha revealed, that God revealed everything to Elisha. Understand the time of massive change, in time of the massive transition from one leader to another. God is saying to Elisha, I am going to be with you. I am not going anywhere. I am going to be faithful. I am going to be work. It doesn't matter that Moses is gone, Joshua is gone, Elijah is gone. It doesn't matter who's here because I am here. Times of change and transition. It's not about people. It's not about circumstances. It's not about situations. It's about the God who remains. So if we trust him and focus on him, he will continue to work in us and through us as only he can. That's what it means for Elisha to be able to see Elijah be taken to heaven. And the same God who promised that to Elisha is the same God who tells us in change and transition, I'm still here. Focus on me. Finally, in verses 13 through 15, we see God's power, we see God's presence. We see God's power, we see God's presence. Look what it says in verses 13 through 15. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he struck the water. And he said, where is the Lord God of Elijah? When he also had struck the water, it was divided this way and that, and Elisha crossed over. Now when the sons of the prophets who were from Jericho saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And they came to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. Elisha grabbed the mantle, he grabbed the cloak, he grabbed the robe of Elijah, which really was symbolic of his ministry. And I do think it's pretty significant that of everything that remains, the robe remains. It was almost like God was saying that the ministry goes on. It doesn't matter if Elijah is gone or not. So Elisha picks up the robe, the mantle, the cloak, and he goes to the Jordan River. The same river that God divided for Joshua and the Israelites. The same river that God divided for Elijah just moments earlier. And Elisha cries out to God. Where is the God of Elijah? Where is the God that caused the drought and the heavens to close and not give rain for 3 years? Where is the God who brought fire from heaven that consumed the altar in which the Baals were proven not to be real gods and rose up and destroyed the Baal prophets? Where is the God who just took Elijah up in the whirlwind? Where is this God? What he's really asking is, God, are you really with me? Are you still here? Do you remain? And as he hit the water, God divided the Jordan. God's power, God's presence had not left. God remained. And not only did Elisha know it, but also the 50 prophets. They saw a physical, tangible way that God was going to work through Elisha just like he worked through Elijah. That while Elijah was gone, God had remained. Christian, in times of change, in times of transition, we too often we focus on people and situations and circumstances. We delve into fear and we dwell on the things that we can control. And what we need to understand, that in times of change and transition, it's not about our will. It's not about our ways. It's not about a person. It's not about a thought. It's not about an idea. It's not about a transition. It's not about anything. It's about God. It's about His will. It's about His ways. It's about His work. It's about His plan and His desire to continue to work through His people. In times of change, in times of transition, our focus must always remain on the God who remains. We must focus on His will, His plans, His way, His calling, His direction. Because it is and always about Him. We focus on the God who remains. So as we come to the end of our text, the question we always like to ask is how should we allow this text to impact us? How should we allow this text to move us? How should we respond to it? And honestly, I would tell you, I think the only thing that we can do is to trust the God who remains. In times of change, in times of transitions, in times of difficulties, in times of uncertainties, we need to trust the God who always remains. Christian, change is inevitable. Change will happen, and God always works through change. Change is not something to be feared. Change is not something to be avoided. Change is not something to control. Change is just something that we allow God to work in us and through us for His will and for His glory. It's never about a person. It's never about a situation. It's never about a circumstance. It's never about a program. It's never about a process. It's never about a vision. It's never about a strategy. It is and always will be about Him. So in times of uncertainty and fear, we trust Him because He never goes anywhere. He's faithful. So with that understanding, how does this apply to you personally? Well, it does depend on who you are. Do understand this morning that if you are not a Christian, if you're not a believer, if you don't really completely buy into some of the stuff that we're talking about, one thing that you and I are going to agree on today is that you won't change in your life. And you may not admit it, but you won't change. That's why you're changing all the time. You're changing your job, you're changing your look, you're changing your hobby, you're changing your situation, you're changing your friends, you're changing your relationships. You're constantly changing. But the neat thing is that you're never satisfied. And let me tell you why you're not satisfied. You're not satisfied because what needs to be changed is you. And you take you everywhere you go. So you can change all the externals you want to. Eventually, it's still going to hit the fan because you're there. What needs to change, what needs to happen, is for you to change. And you can't. You can't change yourself. I don't care how many groups you go to. I don't care how much support you have. I don't care how many therapy books you read. You can't change yourself. None of us can. So what do? You go to the one who can change you. The one who can truly give you the joy you're looking for, the peace you're looking for, the contentment you're looking for, the satisfaction you're looking for. The one who could actually make you feel content with yourself. And that person is God. And the only way that you can be changed is if you come to God through faith in Jesus Christ. That if you come to Him and say, I understand that Jesus, God the Son, died on the cross to pay a debt that I can't pay so that I can be forgiven of my sin and so that He can give me His righteousness that I may be in a relationship with God. When you come to Him telling Him what you really already know to be true, then you come into a relationship with God. And He changes, transforms you from the inside out. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, Paul says that in Jesus Christ, all things are made new. The old has passed away. Behold, He makes us new. Today, the only way that you're going to find satisfaction, joy, contentment, and peace is if you come to God through faith in Jesus Christ, who will change you on the inside out. And this God who changes you and transforms you will never leave you. He will remain with you forever. And that's what He's offering to do with you today. Just a few moments, we're going to have an invitation. That means that you're just invited to respond to what the Holy Spirit is telling you right now. And what the Holy Spirit is telling you, I may not have understood everything, but I know that's true. And I need to respond to it. During the invitation, we'll be standing and singing. You just come down front. There'll be several of us guys down here. We'd love to talk to you more about Christ and how He'll change your life. Christian, what about us? Well, here's the truth, Christian. You are never going to be what you've been called to be. You are never going to be what He saved you to be, created you to be, unless you give every part of your life to Him. Unless you allow Christ to invade every part of your life. Unless you allow Him to work in every area of who you, not holding anything back, but giving it to Him. And I will tell you that if you give everything to Him, He will change you. He will transform you. And in that, it's scary. In that, there's some uncertainty. But the only way we're going to be what He's called us to be is if we give Him everything, all that we are and all that we have. And then He will lead you to do things that you never thought you would do. He will call you to say things you thought you would never say. He will put you in positions that you never thought you would be because He will change you and transform you for what He's calling you to do. And in that scariness, in that uncertainty, you've got to trust Him and what He's doing. So, Christian, my question to you this morning is this. What is He calling you to do? What is He leading you to do that He's probably going to have to change you to get you there? And right now, what you're probably saying is, I really don't know. And I agree with you, you don't know. So let me ask you this. Have you asked Him? Have you asked Him what He wants you to do? Where He wants you to go? Because I promise you, if you seek him with all of your heart, he will let you find him. And if you will give him everything that you have, he will change and transform you and use you in ways that you can never imagine. And yes, it will be scary. And yes, it will be uncomfortable. And yes, there'll be insecurity. But if you keep your eyes on him, it will be amazing. Because you'll see God do things in you and through you that you have never imagined. When we serve a king, you can't stay the same way, doing the same things in the same places and expect him to do amazing things. You've got to give him everything and allow him to change you from the inside out, leading you to do awesome things in his name. Christian, God will change you and he will transform you. You just got to trust him and keep your eyes on him. Before we move forward, though, I do want to talk about the elephant that's in the room. You know me long enough to know that I have to talk about the elephant in the room. You can smack the elephant, you could hug the elephant, you could pat the elephant, but you can't ignore it. Never ignore the elephant in the room. So what's the elephant in the room? Change and transition is coming in this church. Change and transition are going to happen. Change and transition is something that God is leading right now. He's in it. He's working through it. And in the change and transition, we do not need to be afraid. We do not need to grab a hold of it. We do not need to try to avoid it. We need to seek the King. We need to understand that it's never about a person or a situation or a circumstance. It's about the God who remains. And his calling and his purpose and his direction for this church has not changed. So your calling as a church is to seek him. Do not make it up as you go along. Do not do what you think is right with you or what's best for you or what makes you comfortable. Your job is to seek and to focus on him at every move, at every juncture. Because if you will seek him, you will follow him, he will reveal himself, and he will do amazing things in this church. What he's done in the past, what he's done in the present, he will do in the future because he is the God who remains. The only question that's really on the table is if you're going to follow him. Will you seek the God who remains? Because if you do, you'll realize that when God makes a change, it's always amazing. So as we come to the invitation, Christian, I encourage you to do two things. Number one, individually, to lay yourself before your King and say, what do you want me to do? Where do you want me to go? What do you want to change? What do you want to move in my life? I'm all in because I want to see you work. And I'm going to trust you through every step of the way. Even though I know it's going to be uncomfortable, there's going to be fear, and I'll have a lot of insecurity. Whatever you want, I'm all in. And the Christian, I encourage you as a church, as a group to say, God, you are the God of change. You are the God of transition. We trust you. We have our hands on you. We will follow you. Make yourself known in a practical and tangible way. Choose to seek him right now. You need help with that. You need encouragement. We'll be down here. The altar will be available. You can pray with those beside you. But no matter who you are today, let's take this moment and let's truly seek and trust the God who remains and understand that it's always about him. Dear God,